Well, howdy, folks, and welcome to the Chinwag.
The Chinwag.
The Chinwag.
Good to see you, my man.
Nice to see you, sir. This is Stephen Asma.
That is correct. And this is Paul Giamatti.
Very good. Very good. I said Asma. You didn't say Giamatti, but that's okay.
Should it be Giamatti?
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it's supposed to be. It doesn't matter. It doesn't.
Do Italians hit you with the right pronunciation, or are they also
mystified?
They do.
Yeah, they do.
No.
They do. People get... it's weird. It's a weird thing to say your name two different ways. Your own name to mispronounce it, because it's a strange thing. Oh, the world is a weird and wondrous place, Steve. How are you doing? How was the weekend?
It was very good. I had a great time. I didn't do too much. I am reading a whole bunch of stuff. It's great that some of our guests are so smart that we've got to read up on their books and their stories.
It's absolutely true. And in fact, we have been reading up on the next guest that we're going to have, because we're going to talk to Ted Chiang, who is arguably one of the great living science fiction writers, and arguably one of the greatest practitioners of science fiction.
Of the art, yeah.
He has a small body of incredibly deep, profound, and amazing work, and I think he crafts these short stories beautifully, and each one of them. Yeah, he's the closest thing we have now to somebody like Borges, or those great kind of philosophical writers.
And I guess he was into Isaac Asimov and some of the classic writers, but we didn't.
Arthur C. Clarke.
We didn't ask him about Clifford Simak, the hidden gem of sci-fi.
Well, and we'll get him back here, and he is the hidden gem of sci-fi. Well, we'll get him back here and to actually ask him more about the history of science fiction and his relationship to science fiction. But yes, our guest today is Ted Chiang. His fiction has won 4 Hugo, 4 Nebula, and 4 Locus awards, which is basically cleaning out any science fiction award you can get.
Every award possible.
Basically. And he has been featured in Best American Short Stories.
Yeah, and his debut collection, Stories of Your Life and Others, has been translated into 21 languages. The title story was adapted into a wonderful feature film called Arrival, and I have a feeling that many of our members of our community will know Arrival quite well, I suspect. Yeah. And if you don't know it, make sure you see that.
It's a really good movie. It's one of the best science fiction movies in quite a while. He also writes on the topic of technology for the New Yorker magazine. I'm a huge fan. I know that you are, Steve.
Yeah.
I'm really, really thrilled to have him joining the Chinwag today. Welcome, Mr. Ted Chiang. Hello, Ted. Welcome to Chinwag.
Welcome.
Thanks very much. I sort of figured if Paul Giamatti asks you on a podcast, you really don't have a choice.
Nice.
Wow, that is nice. Thank you. That's a nicer reaction than probably most people have had.
Yeah, how could I say no?
Thank you.
I couldn't.
The nature of the Chinwag, Ted, is that we take all kinds of left turns and we don't stay on any topic in a sustained way. But I wanted to ask you about UFOs. And so there's a lot of non sequiturs here. You've written a lot about alien cultures and tech, and you've done a lot of speculative narratives and thinking about it. And it's so hot in the news now. And I myself, Paul and I have talked about this, I'm quite skeptical, but I'm also kind of more excited than I've ever been because of some of the video and the fact that the government's involved. I don't know whether I'm getting just suckered by this stuff or not, but what's your general sense of the probability that we have some alien life forms here? Or do you think this tech is just a foreign government, or the whole thing's just a charade?
And are you generally skeptical that we've been visited at all by these things in the first place? Any and all of those?
I am profoundly skeptical that we have ever been visited by extraterrestrial intelligence, and profoundly skeptical that there is anything in some Pentagon basement.
Okay, we're done here, Ted.
Are you skeptical about intelligent life anywhere else in the galaxy or universe?
No, I'm not skeptical about that at all. We don't have any good evidence for it, but it is an entirely plausible hypothesis. But that is almost completely unrelated to believing that we have been visited in the past, or that we have been visited very recently. So, as an analogy, let's say someone came to you and said, the Pentagon has Darth Vader in a basement.
I'd believe that.
If someone came to you and said the battle between the Empire and the Rebellion has reached our neck of the solar system, and Darth Vader was in one of his fancy TIE fighter and it crashed, and the government has recovered his TIE fighter and have him held in a jail cell underneath the Pentagon, how much credence would you give them?
Well, I suppose not in that instance, yes. I mean, because we're talking about a fictional character that I know doesn't exist.
That is very close to what is happening. The difference between these two scenarios, between the government having Darth Vader in a jail cell and the government having like remains of like a downed UFO and some little green man.
Yeah.
The difference between those is minuscule. It is almost imperceptible compared to the distance between either of those and, say, any finding of extraterrestrial life. Mm-hmm. In a very important sense, because, they are examples of someone basically mistaking a story for reality.
Interesting.
And, in the same way that you can't prove that the Pentagon doesn't have Darth Vader in a jail cell, but if someone came to you and said that, you would not spend any time at all evaluating their claim.
Paul might.
No. So it's true. It's a true statement that isn't provable. Ultimately, you can't prove it, but it's obviously true that they don't have.
You can be as confident about that as you can be about anything. So if it turns out they do, that would blow your mind. It would blow your mind. Let's take another example. Paul once played an assassin in a movie, a really vicious assassin who led a gang of assassins. Now, if I were to say Paul Giamatti is actually an assassin who leads a vicious gang of assassins,
it's a great story.
And of course, so Stephen, how much credence are you going to place in this claim? Paul is, of course, going to deny it because assassins.
He wants to keep working in Hollywood.
Assassins are always going to deny that.
Right.
That because it's part of the job. So Stephen, with the understanding that of course Paul would deny that he is an assassin and tried to kill Clive Owens, who was protecting a baby. Of course, Paul would deny that. If someone says, I am quite certain, and if someone says, I am completely rational, I'm just trying to consider the evidence, and based on my investigation, I'm pretty sure Paul Giamatti is a vicious assassin. Stephen, how much time would you spend evaluating that claim?
It's a great thought experiment. This is what your books do so well, what your stories do so well. Of course, if you ask me this, it's a weird, because I'm a trained philosopher. I think if you had asked me this 10, 20 years ago, I'd be like, I'm not going to give this any time at all. But as I've gotten older and maybe my brain's softer, I'm like, well, maybe my sense of what's reasonable is much broader than it was when I was younger.
So you're saying that you are going to assign a significant probability to the statement, to the assertion that Paul Giamatti is a vicious assassin?
I don't want to rule it out entirely, but yes, the probability would be very small. Yeah, maybe infinitesimally small.
First of all, first thing I want to point out, Ted Chiang, is that I'm astounded that you've seen Shoot 'Em Up. That I'm amazed. That's the thing that might come out. I might come out of this conversation most amazed that you have seen Shoot 'Em Up. Have you actually seen that movie?
I have.
Did you enjoy that movie?
Fantastic.
I did.
Do you enjoy action movies like that and stuff like that?
I'm an action movie fan, and I have to say it was a delight to see you in an action movie role.
Thank you. I'm playing a particularly brutal killer like that. But I get what you're saying, and so what's interesting to me is so you think, in some sense, in terms of UFOs and aliens in the basement of the Pentagon. It's as if our imaginations have become a dumping ground of all this kind of popular cultural imagery. And people are having a hard time distinguishing between what was obviously not real and what is real. Steve and I talk a lot about this, the kind of our imagination running amok. And that in some sense, that's what's happening here. People are not able to sort of differentiate these two things.
That is what I think is happening. There are people who have experiences which, I can't explain, but I don't need to be able to explain them in order to, say like, that is not, what you think happened is not what is actually happening. Because if someone said, I had an experience which convinced me that Paul Giamatti is a vicious assassin, it's like, I don't know why that person thinks that. We could have an interesting conversation about why someone thinks that, but at no point is the subject under serious discussion whether Paul Giamatti is actually a vicious assassin.
But there are people currently who are believing a lot of really wacky stuff. I mean, there are people who believe right now that JFK is not dead. And it's very hard to distinguish whether they're playing at something in order to kind of be contrarian or to be provocative, or how much they actually believe it. And some people do seem to en masse be believing kind of crazy things these days. I wonder how much of that has to do with social media and stuff like that. How much of it is eroding people's ability to base things in fact in some way, that the basis of fact is eroding because of just this constant, quick, fast-moving influx of crazy information is maybe actually allowing people to believe crazy stuff more than they used to even.
I'm not sure that there's an increase. It'd be interesting to see like some sort of data about, that, because the National Enquirer used to sell lots and lots of copies before the realm of social media. Whatever wacky thing.
Demon baby, alien abduction.
Demon babies, and
the Weekly World News or whatever. Those were popular, well before social media. They were, in every supermarket. Do we have any good data to say that people are believing in that more now than they are in the past? I'm not saying that they aren't. It's just that, like, I'm not sure what the data would look like to support that.
Here's a suggestion. Like you wrote this story that like I really liked a lot called Omphalos. You sort of were imagining what would it be like if 19th century natural theology was still the science of the day. Like we were still operating under the guise that if you looked at nature, you'd see the handiwork of God. And then you're sort of imagining
6,000 years old and stuff like that. And dinosaur
means
bones
belly
were planted.
button. And so it's a great story. And I really love it. And you're sort of thinking like, well, what would it be like if your science was built on a very different foundation? And the history of science shows us like that this is true, like in the actual history of science. And then I had the strange good fortune to interview Ken Ham, who's the director of the Creation Museum in Kentucky. And he really is like this character in your story. Like he believes that the earth is like 6,000 years old, that the Grand Canyon was made in the flood. And I would want to dismiss him as insane, but he was strangely reasonable, except his imagination and his logic was built on this completely erroneous foundation. And I just find that really interesting. Like I don't know what to do with that exactly, but like Paul was saying, the conspiracies are sort of like that. You can find people who are totally rational, but down at the bottom, the foundation of their beliefs are just really wacky. And they have no way to check it against external reality because they only talk to other creationists or they only talk to other, conspiracy people like in their little bubble. So I think like the social bubble is also contributing maybe to the problem.
That is definitely an issue. It's hard to compare across, decades.
Yeah.
There were certainly times in the past when people heard from a very sort of limited set of people and they could all sort of reinforce each other. That phenomena, I think, has been going on, probably forever. Now, it has taken on a different form with, these sort of social media or online echo chambers. And arguably it is more dangerous now because of sort of the speed of the internet and, how these things have been kind of weaponized for political purposes. That is maybe like the most plausible argument for us being in a fundamentally different era. The fact that it is now, I think, very easy to weaponize it for political gain. More broadly speaking, there have always been people who believed, things that I will say, completely not true. They were surrounded by people who believed the same things. So that I think is kind of a long-standing characteristic of human culture.
The speed with which it happens, to me, seems to be the thing that's most pernicious, actually. One thing will hit you, then another thing will hit you, then another thing will hit you. And that seems to me to be the difference, that you can't process anything before another thing is hitting you. It might not even be the quality of the information or the amount of it. To me, it seems like the speed is crazy. Does that seem true?
It is definitely a big change. Although, like, the speed of information also, is occurring even, for completely legitimate information. Because, back in the day, you would read a newspaper once a day and then maybe watch the nightly news.
Yeah.
Nowadays, people are refreshing a page every few minutes.
Yeah.
The idea that you would expect to get, new updates about, even, factual things every few minutes, that expectation is...
Well, that whole thing with the Titan submersible just recently was just this crazy example of like this constant updating of this thing that was clearly just, they weren't going to find this thing anytime soon. And it was just a crazy news feed constantly.
So like our expectations about how rapidly we should be getting updates, that has changed. Even things like the 24-hour cable news. It wasn't that long ago when that idea seemed absurd. How could you possibly fill 24 hours a day with news?
No, you can. And then what begins to happen is then you have a lot of people speculating about the actual news. Yeah. That's mostly what you have, is people then speculating. And so then you have this kind of playing around with the news.
Of anxiety.
That, should be being presented as just fact to whatever extent you can just present fact. It's getting all bent out of shape by 6 people sitting there constantly chewing over it and sort of confusing it in some ways. And that seems like another change, that it becomes editorializing on top of it. Constant editorializing is mostly what's happening rather than fact presentation.
Yes. These are big changes which are affecting, sort of our attention span and how we process the information we get, even in largely factual realms. But these factors are also at play in, when it comes to, conspiracy theories or just stories that people are spreading.
There's an anthropologist who, I think David Wengrow, and he looks at like the history of when these monocultures meet other monocultures and then become like, you have like trade centers, port towns where the East and the West are meeting each other historically. And he claims that whenever there's this kind of very cosmopolitan hub, you find lots of folklore imagery of monsters. And because his argument is something like, when you're encountering all these different people with different beliefs and they look different, it raises the anxiety level. This is his thesis. And so then the monsters are sort of ways in which people are trying to, like, I guess, project their anxieties into culture and try to handle it and deal with it. And I'm wondering, with all the news cycle and just constant 24/7, like, stories of like famine in Sudan and civil war over here, I wonder if it is this sort of like the higher anxiety level. And then I wonder if we are seeing more like aliens and monsters in popular culture as a way to try to mediate some of that. Does this make sense? Is this
kind of externalizing your neuroses and stuff? That's kind of like,
Yeah, I think that is entirely plausible. I would want to see, someone say like, okay, how do we quantify this? How much of this was happening, in these various decades in the past? How does it compare to what we have today? But on a related note, when Orson Welles did his War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and it seems like, a lot of people thought it was actually happening. And that was probably a reflection of the anxieties at the time. What we, call UFOs first the reports of UFOs, really started during the Cold War. And again, probably a reflection of the anxieties of the time. I'm not sure how to measure that. I'm not sure how to compare the anxieties of the Cold War with the anxieties of today.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think a similar mechanism is at work.
Certainly something that people are anxious about now is AI, in a sense. It's that's this sort of like boogeyman right now that seems very sort of real world, and this sort of singularity idea, which is something I'm going to ask you to define. Sorry, I'm taking another turn here, but it's something I'm going to ask you to define, because I'm sure it's a term I'm using incorrectly, which to me, it's just like the machines are going to take over. That's what it is. And I'm sure that's not exactly what it means, but I'm interested in to talk to you about AI and about the fears of it, the pessimistic views of it, the dystopian views of it, and if there's a utopian version of it. Because I talked to a guy who says to me the singularity has already happened. As far as he's concerned, when we invented the wheel and we discovered fire, the machines, we became so dependent on the machines that they've kind of been ruling us this whole time.
So the current usage of singularity was really introduced in 1993 in a paper that the science fiction writer and mathematician Vernor Vinge wrote. He wrote a paper called The Coming Technological Singularity. And what he meant by it was that a point in the near future where machine intelligence would exceed human intelligence and then rapidly become, ever greater, ever more powerful. It would basically mean the end of human history. Not that, we would end, but he saw it as this fundamental shift into a realm where humans are not the primary actors, and it would be essentially impossible for us to predict or imagine what happened after that point. For him, the singularity was kind of a predictive event horizon. His idea was that, you can sort of see a bit into the future. You can imagine, like what's going to happen in the next few decades. But once you hit the singularity, all bets are off.
All bets are off.
Interesting.
You cannot predict what's going to happen after that. And that paper turned out to be very influential, and it has really gained a life of its own. The idea of the singularity has gained a life of its own. So to sort of tie into what I was saying before about sort of people kind of mistaking a story for reality, I think there is something similar at work here. I don't think it's a coincidence that Vernor Vinge is a science fiction writer.
Right.
And he was sort of offering a narrative which is very sort of compelling in a sense. It's a narrative which really sticks in the mind. If it weren't in a science fiction story, we'd say like, oh, that is a really interesting idea. It is, it is such an interesting idea that, I think a lot of people, they wound up thinking about it as a thing that could actually happen. That is how Vinge was proposing it. He did think that it would actually happen. I guess I tend to think of it as, it's a very compelling story idea.
Right.
But that's entirely different than saying it's something that will actually happen or could actually happen. As for like, has the singularity already happened in any, there are people, who discuss this in science fiction and in sort of adjacent communities. And I think, the best argument I've heard for the singularity already happening would place it not at the invention of the wheel or because technology is part of being human. It is our nature, to create technology. So technology has been with us from the very beginning. But like, if you're going to pick an invention, at which point we sort of lost control and the technology took over, the suggestion that I have heard that I like is that the singularity happened when we invented the limited liability corporation. Because that is the technology which really took over and changed society in a way that sort of moved it out of the human realm. because that idea was sort of the beginning of this idea of that corporations are a type of entity which have an importance, have a significance, that they're in some ways more important than people, that they can be more powerful than people, and they are sort of abstracted from people. They exist kind of independently of people. And our society has now sort of become, designed to further the goals of corporations.
Yeah.
And so there is a really good argument to be made that, that was when the singularity happened.
So you mean like sort of risk assessment, like actuarial kind of things, like sort of that kind of thing?
Sort of the idea that shareholder profit is the most important thing.
Oh, I see.
And that you can make an almost, a potentially unlimited amount of money, but there is very little potential downside. It frees up or it empowers capital that that maybe arguably capital wasn't empowered before.
There's legal protections for corporations that didn't exist even like 10 years ago. So are you saying that the capital machine, the system, no longer has the constraints of like human factor or human size concerns, and as a result, it's almost like that notion of singularity is that humans are just going to be crushed under the boot of late stage capitalism? Is that what you're suggesting? Okay.
Because the AI will more effectively run all of this stuff than human beings.
Well, okay. So when people, right now, when they talk about the singularity and being afraid that AI will take over and we won't be able to stop them. Yeah, they are talking about what I think is basically, a science fiction story. It's a story that's been around for a very long time. We currently cite things like the Terminator as an exemplar of it. But, the idea that machines or computers might take over, that's been around for a century. And I personally, based on sort of my experience with computer technology, I don't think that is anything that we need to worry about. So that popular, sort of the current contemporary fear of, the singularity, I think is entirely unwarranted. However, the technology that is currently called AI, it is not a machine that is smarter than people. It is not a machine that has, goals of its own. It's not a machine that, wants things. It's not a machine that's going to try and ensure its own survival, which are all, part of sort of the contemporary narrative.
That's the mistaken assumption, I think.
Right? But that's that whole sort of catastrophic idea that they'll make themselves impossibly smarter. They will make themselves smarter.
Yes, that is not anything that we need to worry about. What I think
I agree.
Because it's not possible. They won't be able to do it.
No, I don't think it's possible. But the technology that people currently refer to as AI, I think the best way to understand it is a knife sharpener for the blade of capitalism.
Oh, God, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It is a way for companies to gain greater control over their employees, over their customers, over everything. It is a way to extract more value out of people and then probably give it to shareholders. It's mostly a way of sort of empowering the systems that we are constantly struggling against and that most of us are kind of trapped in.
It like streamlines greed is what it sounds like, right? It just makes it more efficient. And so the computers don't have the goals or the agenda. It's still human greed.
Right. It's
or
the
selfishness.
Deployment.
You can't put a check on this thing. Paul and I were just reading this article about in order to feed the AI, you have to tag all these images and texts.
And that requires enormous human labor.
Yeah. So like people in Nairobi are being paid like $1 a day to like spend hours. This
identifying
is a shirt.
Pictures. Right.
This is a dog.
This is
and then somebody's making billions at the top end from all that labor. It's like,
I was amazed to learn because I think I buy into this sort of notion that the AI at a certain point is in control and is building itself. But in fact, it still requires an enormous number of human beings at some baseline to be training it in how to be AI in some weird way. I had no idea about that.
Yeah. Yes, yes. There's a researcher named Kate Crawford, and she's done a lot of work on this. And one of the things she kind of says is that it's people all the way down. It's not artificial and it's not intelligence. It's an industry built on the labor of humans, but often, in a way that hides all of that. There is this attempt to make it seem as if, it's all a machine. But we're only shown like, oh, well, look, here's ChatGPT. It's this incredibly powerful computer. First, it was built off of the internet, all the content of of billions of web pages that humans wrote, and then all that information was sort of processed and blended together. But it also requires an incredible amount of human labor to sort of render it useful. And so, there are people involved at every step, and the vast majority of them are uncompensated. The people who wrote provided the information on the internet, they're not being paid. And the people who are doing this sorting through of data, they're being paid almost nothing. And a lot of times they're forced to look at, like really horrible stuff. Because that's
like what's pornography and what isn't.
Right. Well, what's pornography? Like what's unacceptable and toxic? Murder, it sounds like a lot of it is actually trying to eliminate what's toxic and horrible, so that you have this kind of genial thing that we're going to interact with that isn't going to have any of that in it.
Yes, and it's sort of analogous to like whenever we go to any store and we buy a neatly packaged product off the shelf, and it all seems like, oh, well, look how great this is. This product just appeared on the shelf, and I got it. But of course, there's a huge infrastructure behind it. There are giant, warehouses and industrial machinery and all these things. There are strip mines that are, that are sort of at the root of this.
Right.
And then there are, huge assembly lines and semi-skilled laborers involved in all of that. But all of that is sort of hidden from us.
Yeah.
Because, what we see is just like, oh, these nicely packaged products on the shelf.
And in this instance, it's like, oh, I can make a funny picture that's a combination of it's Bugs Bunny, he's a cowboy, and it's Bugs Bunny, it's John Wayne or whatever. You can just do this fun stuff with it in a lot of ways. I was amazed to learn that there are people who are hired to sit and converse with the chatbot thing to teach it to have more human responses. Yeah, which was just astonishing. So in a way, it's like I feel like what you're saying basically is it will only ever be as bad as we are in some way. Is that right?
Well, I mean, the technology that is currently powering things like ChatGPT, it's fairly limited, which is not to say that, there aren't cool things coming out of it. It's, I think, a mistake to regard it as intelligent. Like, to the extent that it gives you correct answers, it's like, well, okay, that's what a regular search engine does. That's what a library does. So
old school.
Yeah. So,
but what do you say to the people who say, arguably, though, it's what we do too, though? It's that we draw on this sort of storehouse of information. How is it really all that different from us?
But people are not libraries. People are not just a collection of information. Sometimes people call these programs large language models. That is the conventional term. But from a linguistic standpoint, they're not using language at all. They are using text, because language is a mode of communication. It's a means of, by which one person or one entity communicates with another. Animals communicate. We happen to use language, but we're still engaged in a process which is similar to what animals do when they communicate with each other. There is someone trying to convey information to someone else. ChatGPT has no intention. It has no intent to communicate. It is not trying to say anything to you. You can think of them as like autocomplete on steroids, generating what is the most likely word to come next. Of course, there are huge differences in a technical sense between the autocomplete on your phone and ChatGPT. There's not that big a difference, I would say, in terms of like how much communicative intent is there. When your phone suggests the next word for you when you are texting, there is no communication going on between you and your phone. When people use language, there is something else going on underneath, which is entirely absent from programs like ChatGPT.
There was that thing just in the paper recently where the guy was having the conversation and it took all these weird dark turns. It was in the Times,
Sure.
And it did at a certain point become interesting to me when the thing started insisting that it was in love with the guy. I love you. Your wife doesn't love you as much as I do. And the guy kept telling it the thing to stop. Was interesting to me because I wasn't quite sure what was going on. Why didn't it? Was it just caught in some sort of glitch? Because looking at it from my completely fantastical actor's brain, I was like, it's getting pissed off at the guy. It's coming back at the guy in this passive aggressive way because he violated its boundaries. He was insisting that it violate its boundaries, so it started testing his boundaries. It just appears that way, is what you're saying. But
I think you're projecting that.
I'm sure I am. No, I'm sure I am projecting it.
What the large language thing does is it combs like a whole bunch of romance novels for the last 200 years.
But it was such a peculiar thing for it to be doing in that moment, it was so odd. And I didn't know whether that's because it got stuck somewhere that it couldn't get out of, or what was happening with it. But it was very strange.
I think Stephen is right that it is basing that on a lot of like sort of romance fiction and probably a lot of fan fiction online. There's a certain interaction which looks like, oh well, actually this pattern looks like two characters in a romance novel having a fight,
right.
And so it's like, oh, okay, so here's a pattern. And so it's
that's funny.
I can continue this pattern because ChatGPT is like, it's going this seems like a very plausible way to continue this interaction based on thousands of examples that started out similar to this, and it's like what happens next? Well, it's this series of text tokens. It's a sort of an escalating conflict because that's kind of a trope of fiction. Of romance fiction, of fan fiction,
right?
Can I ask you a question though, Ted? For both of you guys, really, but let's grant everything you've said about, and I agree with you that I don't think computers have intentionality because I think you need feeling states and bodies for that to happen. But let's grant all that. What about this though? What is it called? Is it super stimulus? And it's like when human beings have a kind of psychology that prefers a more melodramatic version of the stimulus. And also there's this human psychology of parasociality, which is I can sort of become, people probably project on Paul because they've seen him in shows that they have like a great friendship with him because he's a celebrity. Now, if you put these two things together, like the human psychology is kind of a sucker, aren't we going to end up with more like actual romances between humans and AI robotics? Because people seem to be entering into like this is my partner now. I come home from work and I talk to her. Yeah,
that is happening a lot.
And I got a robot too for the physical stuff. You know what I mean? Like it seems to be tilting. People are willing to give up real love and friendship in order to have this mock version because it's so high level.
Yeah. So, and I think what you were talking about, the supernormal stimulus.
Yeah, supernormal stimulus.
Yeah, what is that? Just say what that clarify. Is again for.
So I like a common example is that if you show a bird a real egg and a big fake egg, they will preferentially try to sit on and hatch the big fake egg because
that's awesome.
It's it's got more.
It's stimulating them.
Yeah, it's got more eggness, and so
right, right.
Another example that for humans is that, junk food has an intensity of flavor, which, is, doesn't really, it's not found in nature. And
no, the colors of it most of the time are not found in nature.
And so, junk food is very appealing because it's like, oh my God, this is, it's a sensory blast, which, is not found in nature, but we prefer it because it's giving us more of what we want than than
the real thing.
Than the real thing.
Right.
So romantic relationships with bots, yes, I think that is a concern. It's a problem.
And is it because it will feed back to you more of what you want to hear? Is that what you're saying, Steve? That it will like sort of, it will press those. Yeah.
I'm guessing.
So I think one of the tough things about relationships with other human beings is that there is always going to be, a certain back and forth that, the other person, they have needs and you have to, support them in their needs too. They have, they will want things from you. You will have to make an effort. That is one of the things about, like any sort of real human relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or, just a friendship, sometimes you will be called upon to make an effort.
Yeah.
And, sometimes you will have fights and then you're going to have to work through them. That is not fun. But yeah, a robot, a chatbot, they will never get in a fight. They have no needs of their own. They have no wants of their own. They will never ask you, to make an effort. It can really be all about you. It never has to be about them. And so, that is very appealing. When people are very young, they often, break up. They're not used to this. They don't know how to do this. And, and they thought it would just be easy. Like if you are new to relationships, and you have the choice of like, well, okay, so here's this thing that will require a lot of work, and here's this thing that won't require a lot of work. It would be very tempting to go for the thing that doesn't require a lot of work. And, at the sort of other end of the sort of chronologically, there are people who have been through a lot of bad relationships.
Yeah.
They are just tired. They're just exhausted.
Right.
They have just, had a lifetime of shitty, being treated shittily by people. And so it's like, I just want someone who
forget it. Let's just have a robot.
Isn't that,
I just want someone who tells me like, I look nice today. And doesn't make me feel shitty.
Isn't that kind of the utopian ideal with the AI in general, though, that we've reached this point of exhaustion as a species? And it's a little bit like, it would be really great if this thing could make things easier for us. I mean, in some ways, that would be the nice results of this AI, wouldn't it? That it's like, it will be a post-work world where we don't have to do all these things. The good result of this, possibly. And I don't really ever hear people talk much about what's going to be good about this stuff, except I only hear what's menacing and going to be like weird and we're all going to fall in love with our computers. And it's always dark and menacing. And if there's a good side of it,
I have one suggestion for a good side. There's a huge community of young men. They're sometimes called incels.
Guys are all lunatics.
Well,
though.
no, I don't think they are. Some of them are, but some of them are just involuntarily celibate, and they feel like they've lost out. Maybe they weren't as handsome as these other guys, and so I hate to say it this way, but maybe AI robotics could come to give them a more fulfilled. I don't know. I hear myself saying this. And it sounds bad.
Like, that sounds terrible. That sounds like the bad result to me. Dystopian.
Come in here and bail me out.
Yeah, what the hell are you talking about? That sounds dystopian.
Okay, so some people have suggested artificial girlfriends maybe reduce some of the anger and hostility that we see in
those guys.
Yeah, certain communities like the incel community. It's maybe possible, but I guess the argument, the counter argument, which I think is more likely, is that a lot of what drives the incel community is this sense of entitlement. There are people who feel like I deserve more than what I'm getting. If that is the underlying, sort of psychological mechanism at work, then you will almost certainly not find the artificial girlfriend satisfying, because it will always seem like the lesser, not as good as a real girlfriend. For it to really satisfy them, we would need to perceive it as being better than a human girlfriend. And
the narcissism.
Yeah. And that seems unlikely that an artificial girlfriend will seem like, oh, well, I'm a high status because I got the artificial girlfriend. I don't see it as working the way that
I'm with you,
scenario.
Ted. I don't see that. Yeah, I don't see the upside to the incel community. Sorry, Steve.
I just wanted to follow up with what Paul was saying a minute ago about, say, like the post-work future, or like the more utopian scenarios, and why don't we really hear a lot about them? There is a certain vague rhetoric among people who are saying, like, well, AI is going to create just this great future for us, but yeah, it is necessarily super, super vague, because they cannot lay out a detailed or plausible route from here to there using the AI that we have. Even if they were able to provide a kind of more detailed scenario, the idea of, say, a shorter work week has been around for decades. In the early part of the 20th century, they assumed that within a few decades, humans would only be working like maybe 15 hours a week because of automation. And that has not turned out. People work longer hours now than they ever have, even though we have all this automation. And at the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to say, like, the culprit is capitalism. Capitalism is why we don't have a 15-hour work week when we potentially could, given the advances of technology over the last 50 years. And then with regard to, say, again, the maybe utopian scenario that you mentioned, Paul, about, like, okay, so idealized relationships that don't require work, artificial girlfriends or boyfriends who, it's just always easy. Well, I guess two questions. One is, how likely is it? And the other is, is that actually, such a great scenario? Because again, like, if a company is selling you this product, like an artificial girlfriend or boyfriend, their goal is to continue to make money off of it. So that will probably be like some subscription model.
Upgrades.
So in a sense,
purchases.
You are kind of dependent. The subscription model is a way of sort of to create dependency. And so, like, if you have this artificial girlfriend or boyfriend that you just really love, then you will be sort of beholden. It's like, okay, I gotta pay my monthly subscription fee.
But that actually happened. There was a story in Japan where a guy had a sort of virtual girlfriend. She was this in a sort of jar, it looked like, and they canceled her. The company canceled her because they were going to upgrade or something. And he lost this woman he'd been having a relationship with for a while.
Yes.
It was terrible. Actually,
it's and like more recently there was this company called Replica with a K. And they sell these chatbots, which a lot of people use as sort of like girlfriends or boyfriends. A while back, they added a feature for sexy talk, erotic conversation. And this was a very popular feature. But earlier this year, they had to disable that feature because of some regulatory issues. But the thing is, a lot of their customers, they were really, really upset because, like the night before, they had been able to engage in erotic role play with their artificial, boyfriend or girlfriend. And suddenly now their chatbot girlfriend is saying, like, no, I can't talk about that. Like, that's
super puritanical suddenly.
And so they, they are suffering, they're suffering a kind of, a kind of emotional trauma because they've been sexually rejected by their artificial girlfriend or boyfriend.
It's a lot of your stories kind of deal with something that's interesting, because what's interesting is something I take from what you're saying is this idea that it's like, in some ways, it won't be as good a thing to have, because you'll be missing all the human elements of for human growth, but just having this thing that you can deal with. This has been amazing. There's still so much more I want to ask you, but I know we've taken up too much of your time. But this is really,
thank you so much.
We're both huge admirers of yours.
Love your work.
And, it's really amazing stuff. So it's really, really nice to talk to you.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been great.
Cool.
I've had a great time.
Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films, hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma, Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Top, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.